Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder, violence, and sexual assault.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of The Cheat Sheet, where we discuss various news updates in some of the cases we've been covering, and of course, other cases. This is going to be a more relaxed and unscripted conversation between Kevin and I, so just keep in mind that we do a lot of scripted content and heavily reported stuff throughout the rest of the week, but this is just an opportunity for us to sit back and talk with you all about what's been going on and provide updates where it's needed. In today's episode, we're going to be giving you updates on the Delphi murders, the University of Idaho murders, the Long Island serial killer case, and more. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is The Cheat Sheet, footage and forensics.
Why don't we start out by talking briefly about a couple of recent cases of teens going missing?
We saw a report from the news outlet The Grio about two sisters who vanished from Michigan. This was, they were last seen on June 28th, 2023. And this is, of course, 15-year-old Tamara Perez and her 14-year-old sister Iris. Just as a note, Iris has a tattoo of a star on the left side of her neck. These two kids are adoptees who are originally from Florida. Their adoptive parents moved them out to Michigan, and they've gone missing. So we'll include a link to the article in the Grio so you can see their pictures and kind of get a sense. But for folks who are in the Midwest and elsewhere, because they also have links to Florida, Tennessee, you know, let's keep an eye out for these girls. Obviously, the fact that they've been missing for so long is very concerning, and we have the FBI actually getting involved in their case.
And there's another case out there involving 17-year-old Katie Schneider. She's from Saratoga, California. The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office is searching for her. They found her white Honda Accord. Other than that, I'm afraid there's not a whole lot of information out there about this one, but the family is working with police on it.
And both of these cases involve teens who've been missing for quite a while before it necessarily became a very public case. But I want to say in the case of Katie Schneider, her family has put out statements indicating that they were acting upon law enforcement's recommendation when it came to not going public earlier. So we shouldn't be necessarily looking at that as a suspicious action. If they're hearing from law enforcement, hey guys, hold back, we're going to do something first, then that's not suspicious in my book. I just want to say that preemptively.
While we're on this subject, let's talk about another young woman. Earlier this week, we did an episode about Ronli Ratliff.
Yes, this is the case of a 24-year-old young woman who was murdered on April 15th, 2004 in Morgan County, Indiana. The scene was set on fire, and what appeared to be an accident at first turned out to be a homicide, according to the autopsy. Her loved ones still want answers. People who knew her say she was just a beautiful soul, a very sensitive person. She was really having a hard time because her mother, Sandra Allen, was addicted to drugs and heavily involved in drug activity that centered around the Allen's body shop in Mooresville. And basically, Kim Sink, who is Ronli's aunt, has been advocating for justice for years and feels that people in the area know more than they're saying. What we would like is for if you are based in Indiana and you have friends, relatives, connections in or around Morgan County, please just send them a link to the episode or send them some news articles from the episode. We've actually heard from a lot of people who are from this area and they just didn't hear about the case before. So if we can get people in that area really talking about Ronli and remembering her and remembering how important this case is, I think that would be a really terrific thing and could perhaps make some people come forward. Maybe they don't know what they know. Maybe they saw or heard something that didn't seem like a big deal at the time. Maybe they're worried they'll get in trouble for past drug use, but they shouldn't be worried about that because statute of limitations, guys. So let's get people talking. So Morgan County, Indiana, it's between Bloomington and Indianapolis. To give you a sense of surrounding areas, Hendricks is to the north, Marion County is to the northeast, Johnson County is to the east, Brown County is to the southeast, Monroe County is to the south, Owen to the southwest, and then Putnam is to the northwest. So if you know people in Morgan County or those surrounding areas, let's get them talking about Ronli. Moving on to another case that I think you and I were talking a lot about when this happened, although we've never covered it. This is a situation that involves a really horrible murder of law enforcement and the endangerment of young people. On February 2nd, 2021, there was a shootout at around dawn in a place called Sunrise, Florida. And at the end of this, 2 FBI special agents were dead, and so was the perpetrator. What happened was the FBI was going to serve a warrant in a child sexual abuse materials case on a man whose name I only want to mention once because, you know, this person is an utter waste of space, David Lee Huber. And unfortunately, this perpetrator was able to ambush the agents as they came to serve this warrant. And I believe 3 FBI agents were badly wounded, and then 2 were killed. And that was Daniel Alphen and Laura Schwarzenberger. And this is a devastating situation because these 2 FBI agents were, I mean, of course, they're human beings with families. I mean, beloved people. But on top of that, they were doing the incredibly important work of fighting child sexual abuse by taking down some of these predators with these online networks. So this, in my view, is one of the most important things that the FBI does. Protecting kids, dismantling these child sexual abuse rings. Both of these agents were apparently very, very dedicated to that very difficult work. And unfortunately, they lost their lives in this situation. But after this, the FBI did not stop with their investigations. And news came out in CNN recently, and we'll link to the article, that there's been scores of arrests in basically the ring these 2 agents were investigating as part of this sting that went so wrong, unfortunately. So there have been 98 people arrested and 13 kids rescued from these circumstances where people are forcing them into producing these really sick child sexual abuse materials.
We hear a lot of worry and stuff from parents that victims in these cases are kids who have been abducted from loving homes. But I understand that's not really the case for most of these victims. Where do most of these victims come from?
In many cases, they're actually, the abuse occurs at the hands of the people who are supposed to be taking care of them. Now, we don't want to paint with too broad a brush. There's different circumstances in every situation, but oftentimes it's people who are supposed to be the responsible caretaker, or at the very least are close enough to have access to that child. It's not random strangers snatching up kids. It's actually people in their lives who they should be able to trust and who should be protecting them, who are actually abusing them in just an incredibly horrific way. So I was definitely gratified to see that there's been a number of arrests. According to the article, some of these people have been getting away with it for like a decade. And one thing to keep in note is a lot of these perpetrators who are successful, who don't get busted right away, are savvy with IT. A lot of them actually work in IT, and they know how to use computers. They know how to set up a sophisticated peer-to-peer network where they can actually exchange materials without having law enforcement kick down their door. So, you know, it's possible to get these guys, but the ones who are truly dangerous know what they're doing and are able to get away with it for a long time.
You know, these days when we talk about child sexual abuse materials, I admit my mind often turns to Kegan Kline, who was recently sentenced to 43 years for offenses related largely to child sexual abuse materials here in Indiana. And I think we both really hope that we see stronger laws pass, or people who produce this sort of material really can get punished pretty severely for it.
What's so horrifying about Kagan's case, and of course Kagan Klein is the man from Indiana who operated under the Anthony Schatz account. He was catfishing scores of underage girls, pretending to be an adolescent teenage girl or pretending to be a teenage boy, and tricking them into sending him lewd photos and gaining their trust and then betraying that trust. And what's really horrifying to perpetrators like that is there's an element of essentially manipulating a child to participate in their own abuse by photographing themselves and sending it away, and then having themselves be vulnerable to sextortion or further manipulation. And, the devastating psychological impact that can have on a child, even though they're a child, they don't have the ability to necessarily protect themselves from a savvy and sophisticated predator like that. So it's a truly horrific case. And yes, I'm very, very, very hopeful. We recently spoke to the prosecutor on that case, Courtney Allwine, and she talked about the possibility that if the case stands up in the Court of Appeals, there could be an opportunity for significant case law that kind of gives other prosecutors in Indiana a roadmap on how to get appropriate sentences for people who do this, because it's a horrific crime. And if there's an opportunity to protect children from people who do this and show very little remorse or show very little, understanding of what the problem they have is, without that, you don't have a perpetrator who's going to be able to get any better. So, I mean, what do you do with people like that? I would say, I think most people would agree that you keep them away from children. They should be incarcerated.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk about another case out there that's gotten a lot of interest from our listeners. And that is the case of the Tylenol poisonings back in the early 80s in Chicago. And of course, the absolute go-to people on that topic are Stacy St. Clair and Christy Gutowski of the Chicago Tribune. And they've also covered the case on a podcast called Unsealed: The Tylenol Murders. When it comes to this case, these people are the absolute best in the game to go to. And they've been on fire with it. They've gotten more details and more information about this case than anyone else has. And they're still at it. What have they done?
Well, recently they came out with an article. Basically, I mean, they got these videos released in the case and they reported on it, but it was from their records request that these videos came out. And what did these videos show? Well, it's law enforcement investigators, specifically the FBI, undercover FBI agents, talking with James Lewis, who was the prime suspect in this case for years. And they tricked him into setting up this meeting where they were trying to see if he would say anything that would possibly implicate him. He basically did implicate himself, but the local district attorneys and the local prosecutors didn't necessarily feel it was strong enough to take to trial, although I think that's debatable, frankly. He's talking about, what would the killer have done? Well, you have to remember, it was really easy to get cyanide back in 1982. The bombshell moment comes when he says it took him 3 days to write Johnson & Johnson. At that point, the FBI had figured out, essentially, that if that were true, they figured out the postage dates. If that were true, then that means he would have been writing the letter before the death started, before it was publicized.
So this letter you're referring to, this is a letter he wrote to Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturers of Tylenol, in which he expresses knowledge of these deaths. And you're saying he wrote this letter at a time when the knowledge of these deaths had not yet been made public.
That's absolutely right. So he was eventually convicted of that extortion. He wrote to Johnson & Johnson saying, if you want the killings to stop, here's what you do. And they were able to convict him on that. He got a number of years in prison for that, but they were never able to actually convict him for the murders, which is deeply frustrating because he would taunt investigators over the years. This is a person who is a very, very cold individual by all accounts. He was once accused of murdering a client in sort of his tax business. That was unfortunately dismissed due to Miranda violations. He was accused of abduction and rape. He's a person who seemingly just kind of got out of a lot of things through either luck or just, whatever. He was believed to have possibly acted because he wanted revenge on Johnson & Johnson because the sutures in his daughter's heart broke down. She had Down syndrome and had a heart issue, and so complications and the failure of those sutures ultimately are what killed her. So he wanted revenge on Johnson & Johnson, which manufactured those sutures, or at least was the parent company of the manufacturer. Right. So something tragic happens to him, and, he potentially takes that out on a bunch of innocent people, including a young girl who died after ingesting potassium cyanide laced capsules.
And of course, he never was charged with any crime related to the poisoning itself. So though he was always the prime suspect, that case remains at least technically unsolved.
Technically unsolved, but frankly, I mean, I think there's a pretty good case to be made against him. I think I've come to understand more of the importance of caution when it comes to prosecutors. When I was starting out just as a true crime listener, you'd have all these true crime hosts get on and be like, the prosecutor's a coward. They should bring charges on this guy, blah, blah, blah. And I'd be like, yeah, you get caught up in that. Yeah, they should bring charges even though the case sucks. No, that's not how our system works. We're not doing anyone any favors by bringing weak cases against people, because that's how you get people exonerated. And it's not really the prosecutor's job to be spinning the roulette wheel. You should be confident in the case you have before you go forward. So I'm not going to blame prosecutors in this case, but I don't know. I think there was a circumstantial case there, especially with some of his bizarre admissions in these videos. He's talking, yeah.
Whenever we talk about unsolved cases, my mind goes back to Burger Chef, which we covered earlier this week and we're continuing to cover. And one thing with Burger Chef that is so frustrating, you're talking about how you can make a good circumstantial case in the Tylenol murders case. I think in Burger Chef, you could make a pretty good circumstantial case for like 3 or 4 entirely different groups of suspects.
Yeah, who don't know each other at all.
Have no connections whatsoever. It's a very frustrating case. Earlier this week, we talked about some of the FBI files we got out, and we got some pretty great responses from listeners.
Yeah, we were really thrilled and frankly gratified and touched that so many of you reached out to us with your theories. And what we're going to do is we're going to take some of those ideas that you put out there about the Burger Chef murders and run them by some of our sources, and then come back to you and have like a multifaceted discussion about what scenarios could have happened. Recently in our coverage, we were talking about one element of the crime that's always baffled Kevin and I, and that is the movement of victim Jane Freet's car. She's a 20-year-old manager of the Burger Chef. She's one of the victims who's abducted and murdered. But the movements of her car that night are very baffling, and I'll just give a quick summary. If you want to throw your 2 cents in about this, let us know, because we want to hear from you and we want to kind of run down some different ideas, because Kevin and I, this case is the equivalent of just banging your head against a wall for like 3 years. It's really it's hard to do anything with, because there's so many different scenarios, and you don't really have locked down information at all times. So it becomes like a multiverse of possibilities. So this is what happens with her car. She drives a white Vega. The white Vega is, parked in the Burger Chef parking lot. Then she and the employees go missing, and the white Vega is found a few hours later, parked next to a park in Speedway, Indiana, which is actually right next to the police headquarters there. So that's where the car is. And when her body is found, she has a key in her pocket, a key to the car. Tell us about the odometer thing. That's so confusing. I can't even talk about it.
Her car had recently been serviced. The mileage was checked and noted at that time. So we know that the car was not driven from Burger Chef down to the murder scene and back. So basically, it couldn't have gone much further than from the restaurant to where it was located.
Yes. So we know that it wasn't they're found in outside of Greenwood in a wooded area in Johnson County, Indiana.
20 miles away?
20 miles away. So it didn't drive that far. It did not go to the murder site and back. And so what the heck? What exactly happened? And yeah, I don't know.
And before we leave this subject in this episode, as long as people are giving us their thoughts, let's ask another question. One thing that's very strange about this case is usually if you have people at a restaurant who are the victims of violence, or people really at any business that are the victims of violence, if a person is going to commit murder and kill those people, the person will do that while they're still at the business, because it doesn't seem to make any sense to kidnap your victims, travel with them a long distance, and then kill them at another location. Because the longer your victims are with you in the car and alive, they're frankly creating situations that could go out of control. So for you as the killer. So it would seem safer and more prudent if you're willing to kill someone just to do it there at the location.
Yeah, the classic scenario is you round up all the employees into the walk-in freezer or the office and you kill them all there.
So here's a question we'd love to get your thoughts on. In the Burger Chef case, as we said, 4 employees were kidnapped from the restaurant and driven 20 miles south to a wooded area where they were killed. Why? Why did the killer do that? The killer or killers do that? Why did he transport them instead of killing them on site? Would love to get people's thoughts on that.
I'll add a wrinkle to that for you all to think about. Because, I mean, you can always argue, well, they got away with it, so it worked out for the killer. But here's another weird aspect of this. 2 of the victims, Danny Davis and Ruth Shelton, were shot. They were shot with a .38 caliber weapon in the back of the head and the neck. So execution style. They're lying on the ground and they're shot that way. Manager Jane Freet was walked a distance away and stabbed twice in the heart from behind with a knife, with the strength that the knife blade broke off inside of her. And then Mark Flemons, perhaps the most baffling death, he was found a ways away as well, asphyxiated on his own blood. So he was lying with his sort of knees and feet tucked under him, which created almost a slope where the blood ran down and asphyxiated him. And there was, our understanding of the crime scene photos, that the blood was all on his face from his kind of nostrils up. So not on his chin, not like he'd been like pummeled again and again with fists, creating kind of a splatter pattern. And some have speculated that he ran into a tree, which I've always felt very weird about because that just doesn't seem like something that could happen, but I don't know. And we also, you know, I don't know what the forensics say. We don't have the case files from the Indiana State Police. Other people have suggested that he was kind of beaten with maybe brass knuckles or something like that, or there were, you know, indications that he had been beaten and maybe it was just in kind of an unusual way. But the fact of the matter is he could have survived it, unfortunately, is our understanding, if he had kind of landed differently. So how do you get into a situation where you brutally kill 3 people and then the 4th person, maybe if they had landed differently, it would have been a different outcome? That's like, he's on the one hand, one of the more brutal instances in this case, because it's a physical, you know, this blunt force, but at the same time, he's almost left in a situation where, unfortunately, there was a chance he could have survived it. He didn't, but I don't get that at all. We've speculated that maybe he ran for it and something happened. I don't know.
But we'd be interested to know what you all think. Should we talk quickly about the small updates in Delphi?
Yeah. Brad Rosie, who's one of Richard Allen's defense attorneys, has asked for the transcript for the hearing from June 15th, 2023, which dealt with the safekeeping order.
This was the hearing where the defense attorneys were trying to get Richard Allen moved from Westville, which is a place that's a prison, which is usually where people go once they've already been convicted of a crime. The defense wants him to be moved out of Westville and into a county jail, which typically houses people who've not yet been convicted of crimes.
This could mean anything. It doesn't really mean anything. So when we're speculating here, just know that we are speculating. The speculating sign is flashing right now. At any twist or turn in the adjudication of a crime, the defense and the prosecutor have opportunities to appeal decisions made by the judge. So if Nicholas McClellan feels like this was a bad ruling, he can go to the Court of Appeals. If the defense feels that, they can do the same.
And if you're doing an appeal, sometimes it's helpful to have a copy of the transcript from the hearing So you can highlight moments where you think something may have gone wrong.
That is not necessarily what's happening here. There's any number of reasons they could want a transcript. We're not saying that's what is happening here, but we did want to mention it just to underscore that just because a ruling is made, and of course, in this case, Judge Gull ruled against the defense. She said that, they didn't prove what they were stating in court and that, he would stay in Westville. That was the place that could keep him safest. But it's just a note that if any ruling comes down, if it's controversial enough or the defense or the prosecution feels like Judge Gull made the wrong call, they have an opportunity to possibly seek relief from the Court of Appeals. So just as a brief note, we get asked a lot, are they going to film the Delphi trial? Are there going to be cameras allowed to record at the Delphi trial? And the answer is we don't know. But I will say this, Judge Gull worked on the pilot program to allow cameras in courthouses in Indiana. I think there's a decent likelihood that that will happen here as a result of that and because of the strong public interest. And I think because she's had that experience, I think she probably feels comfortable letting in cameras without creating a media circus. So what's your take, Kevin? I think she'll allow it. That's just a guess. I don't know. We don't have any information indicating that. That's just my own feeling.
I think there's every possibility that she will because of her own history with the issue.
But it's always funny when people ask us because it's like, why would we care? We're podcasters, guys. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I think it would be great for people to be able to see this.
And when we talk about press freedoms in Indiana and the ability of press or citizens to record things related to law enforcement, that brings up another recent case.
That is, of course, the case of Donald Nicodemus v. the city of South Bend. So what's going on here? Well, we saw this article written up in the Indiana Lawyer and thought it was quite interesting. On July 1st of this year, in the state of Indiana, a law establishing a sort of 20-foot encroachment zone around law enforcement went into effect. So what does that mean? Citizens cannot approach within 25 feet of a law enforcement officer after the officer orders the person to stop. It's supposed to protect crime scenes. And I think from the perspective of law enforcement, I get that, in the past, in the 1930s and stuff, you had newspaper reporters running all over a murder scene and, messing things up like that. We don't want to go back to that. But at the same time, the reason that this case has been brought about by the American Civil Liberties Union of Indiana is that, there's a possibility that law enforcement can kind of just keep on telling people to back up 25 feet. Maybe they're not even doing anything that's disturbing. Donald Nicodemus says that he is a citizen journalist who posts videos on YouTube of law enforcement and indicates that he complied with orders to move back 25 feet, but then one officer just kept on telling him to move back 25 feet, and he felt that that was unfair. And what the ACLU is saying is that that's a violation of his First Amendment rights and that the law should be essentially struck down on the grounds that it's unconstitutional.
So we will be keeping a close eye on that and watching how it goes.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm just always interested in stuff like that because, frankly, a lot of Indiana is experiencing kind of like a lack of news coverage and like different local news outlets have gone under or they've been shrunk and you have really great hardworking journalists doing amazing work, but they're not able to cover anything. So I don't love the idea of making it harder for people to like let people know what's going on in their communities. Although I can also see the law enforcement perspective and obviously public safety is important. I just feel like there's probably a decent compromise here that's not necessarily being reflected in this law.
I agree. Now, one thing that's not being undercovered is Idaho. What's been going on in the University of Idaho case?
Actually, there have been a couple of updates in the University of Idaho murders. And this is, of course, the case of Brian Koberger, who was accused of murdering Kaylee Gonsalves, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, and Madison Mogan. These 4 kids who were going to the University of Idaho and were murdered in their home in just a very brutal fashion. So one thing that we've seen is that the prosecutor and the defense have both pointed out that August 18th, 2023 at or around 10:30 a.m. is going to be a big time. They both proposed to talk about a whole bunch of stuff at this hearing. And on the prosecution side, they want to deal with a protective order that pertained to investigative genetic genealogy. They said, we used IgG in this case, but we don't want the hundreds of innocent random people who are in the family tree to be named and put out there. They're asking for a protective order. They are also asking for some sort of deliberation on their motion to reconsider order staying time for speedy trial. They're saying like the defendant wants it both ways. He can't just have it where he partially waives his right to a speedy trial. They're asking for the trial to take place in October, specifically October 2nd, 2023. That's when they want to get rolling. And then the last thing is just a scheduling order. They're asking for deadlines for expert disclosures, for pretrial motions and responses and replies, for jury questionnaire proposals, jury instructions, witnesses. Just, they're like, we need to lock all this stuff down because we're getting close here. I mean, we're in August. This thing's supposed to go off in October.
Yeah, we're running out of time.
Ann Taylor, who of course is the defense attorney for Brian Kohberger, she's like, well, yeah, August 18th, but we're going to ask for a few different things. They're once again asking to talk about the third motion to compel, and that is related to discovery. They want the profiles uploaded to the DNA database. They want all the documentation from the testing laboratory, including profiles of unknown males, potentially in this case. They want communications between laboratory personnel and other parties regarding the testing, and as well as any unexpected results. They're saying we have not gotten everything we've asked for when it comes to the forensics in this case, when it comes to the DNA testing. We want it all. So they're continuing to say, give that to us. And in addition to that, they want to talk about the second motion to stay proceedings based on the fact that they're alleging that there was a failure to fully comply with Idaho Code 208, and which states that individuals must be randomly drawn from the county jury list and that the jury commissioner shall draw requisite numbers of qualified jurors for one or more panels or for grand jury. They're saying that there was some error with that. We want to stay proceedings as a result. And then, of course, they want to go back, and we talked about this in depth in our last cheat sheet episode, I believe, or at least in our last discussion about the Kohberger case. They're saying they want the indictment dismissed because they feel that the grand jury was incorrectly instructed on the, essentially like what they should be looking for in the Kohberger case and what's, the requisite burden of proof. So they're both kind of gearing up. We're going to be very interested in everything that happens on August 18th because it sounds like so far that's been built up as kind of a big day. What do you make of any of those kind of back and forths?
I'm really feeling a lot of doubt that this trial is going to happen in October.
You think that's way too much to clear up in like a few months?
This is already the middle of August. That's just 2 months. It seems very unlikely to me.
What do you make of, it's like the kind of the two sides of the DNA thing? The prosecutors basically, like, you guys want to just throw out a bunch of innocent names that really didn't end up, like that's just the byproduct of identifying Kohberger. It was not crucial, and the defense is like, give us everything. That's one sticking point that seems to come up again and again.
Yeah, I can understand the prosecution's point that when you do these things, you do end up getting, when you do these genetic DNA things, you're really casting a wide net, and you're getting a lot of names of people who have no connection to the case. But also, I guess I understand the defense's point of view because they're saying we have a right to all of the work product you've created while doing this investigation, and why should we take your word on it that certain things are not relevant? Right.
We need to see everything regardless.
So I understand why it's a sticking point.
Yeah, I can see that too. One thing that came out of the DNA side of things is on August 9th, 2023, there was an affidavit filed on behalf of the defense, and that was by Leah Larkin. And she is a genetic genealogist who runs a business called the DNA Geek. And one notable thing about her is that when you look through her media appearances in, a variety of high profile publications like BuzzFeed and the New York Times, various things, she's often in the news citing a lot of concerns about privacy, citing a lot of concerns about, how that this, your genetic material is so private and it shouldn't be used in this way. And so she's actually, so it's not that surprising that she's kind of coming in as a bit of an expert for the defense and saying, here's where there could be problems with this. So she's basically speaking to her experience as a genetic genealogist and kind of some of the privacy concerns she's had over the years. And she's basically saying like the core principles set up by the Department of Justice interim policy to limit when forensic genetic genealogy can be used, she's basically saying, like, there's a possibility to kind of circumvent that, and that's concerning. And there's Fourth Amendment violations. There's different cases where this has been handled badly. And she's just coming in, I think, to kind of support the idea that, like, this needs to be scrutinized extensively by the defense. So that's bolstering the defense's argument that, like, we need to see everything. The bombshell information that's recently come out about the Idaho case is of course pertaining to Bryan Kohberger's alibi, or lack thereof. The prosecution has been clamoring for the alibi for a while now, and there's been filings on both sides. And now we're getting a bit more information on what that alibi may be. Before we begin, one thing that we often talk about, Kevin, is that discovery, the prosecution has to pass on discovery to the defense. The defense doesn't really have a similar responsibility to the prosecution. So my question is, why does the prosecution even need his alibi? Like, why is that even a thing?
Is to prepare for the case, because you don't want there to have surprises in the courtroom. It's not a game. This is pretty high, serious stakes. And so it is important, if he has an alibi, for the state to have an opportunity to investigate it, either to debunk it or to prove it. And if he has such a great alibi, perhaps it could, in theory, induce the state to say, oh, you're right, he couldn't have done it, and release him.
Drop charges, let's start from scratch. But I guess what I'm saying is that there are exceptions to that rule, that it's typically the prosecution giving discovery to defense and not the other way around. There are exceptions to that.
Yeah.
Sometimes the defense has to step up and say, here's something for you.
Right.
And so what we learn from this filing from Ann Taylor is this. By statutory definition, Mr. Kohberger may remain silent, yet testify that he was not at 1122 King Road, November 13th, 2022. However, in an abundance of caution and recognizing the court has authority to exclude witnesses, Mr. Kohberger has indicated he anticipates corroborating witnesses. Mr. Kohberger has a long habit of going for drives alone. Often he would go for drives at night. He did so late on November 12th and into November 13th, 2022. Mr. Kohberger is not claiming to be at a specific location at a specific time. At this time, there's not a specific witness to say precisely where Mr. Kohberger was at each moment of the hours between late night November 12th, 2022, and early morning November 13th, 2022. He was out, driving during the late night and early morning hours of November 12th to 13th, 2022. Counsel for Mr. Kohberger is aware that a case law broadens the definition of alibi with the statutory requirement of a specific location to more broadly include disclosure of information that tends to state the person claiming alibi was at a place other than the location of an offense. Mr. Kohberger has complied to the extent possible at this time. Corroboration of Bryan Kohberger not being at 1122 King may be brought out through cross-examination of the state's witnesses. At this time, Mr. Kohberger cannot be more specific about the possible witnesses and exactly what they will say. The defense has been hampered by the state's own choices. The state chose a secret grand jury rather than the planned preliminary hearing. Had the state moved forward with the preliminary hearing, the defense would have had the opportunity to develop testimony through cross-examination and witness presentation. Okay, so, I mean, I think that it's pretty easy to figure out what they're talking about there. They're talking about the witness roommates, the surviving roommates in the house. It seems like they're saying, we don't have an alibi, or we don't have anyone to support our alibi, but we're going to pick apart what the witnesses who survived said.
That's what it sounds like.
Maybe they're going to say, well, you said he was, he had this color eyes, but he actually had I feel like we're going to get something where it's more of a back and forth there. That doesn't sound like an alibi to me. That sounds like picking apart the state's case.
It sounds like basic criminal defense.
Right, which is, no, I mean, like, I'm not throwing shade at that. Everyone's acting like, oh, the alibi, but this isn't really an alibi. An alibi would be if he and his girlfriend were driving around, or he got a drink at a bar at 1 a.m. or something. But I guess they're saying that the statute makes it so that alibis can be very broadly defined. What do you think of all of this?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like much of an alibi. I agree.
It's a bad alibi. I'm sorry. Like this, driving around alone at night is not.
It's not too compelling.
That's not very compelling. But it sounds like they're saying we are going to push back against the witnesses who are saying that this person that was cited in the house is a similar looking person to Brian Kohberger.
Well, needless to say, we're going to keep a close eye on all of this. And probably at some point before too much longer, we'll do a regular episode just devoted to Idaho. Another big case that we've been following is Long Island serial killer, or LISK. What's been happening there?
Well, more DNA stuff. And in this situation, it did not work out well for Long Island serial killer suspect Rex Heuermann. He objected to having to provide a buccal swab for his DNA. And where that comes into relevance is that an FBI investigation, they obtained a pizza crust that he had bitten, and they got DNA from it. And what they want to do now is compare his DNA to a hair found on victim Megan Waterman. Heuermann, of course, is still insisting his innocence. He and his team push back against giving that buccal swab, but Long Island judge Timothy Mazzei ordered him to provide the DNA sample on August 9th. So he will have to do that, and kind of just indicates how important DNA is to a lot of these cases now.
It's absolutely crucial.
Before we wrap up, I want to end on a kind of a weird note, because this article is not about a murder or anything like that, but it's something that I think is an important thing to remember in the true crime online space. Kevin's smiling because he has no idea where I'm going with this.
I have no idea what she's talking about, folks.
Okay. So Nicholas Fandos for the New York Times reported on a situation where you had a group called We Decide New York, Inc., an activist group of volunteers. And after Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York, resigned over sexual misconduct allegations, this group kicked into high gear, with volunteers from it posting a lot of things attacking and blaming the women who came out with allegations against him. And this was made to look like a just totally organic thing of supporters of Cuomo coming out and saying, we want the truth. These women had it coming. But what the New York Times found is a trove of 4,000 text messages, emails, voice memos between the leaders of the group and Madeleine Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo's sister. So, okay, why are you bringing this up, Anya? I just want to say that I think we're going to be seeing a lot of stuff like this in true crime in the years to come. I think this is an instance of the internet and people being weaponized to further one narrative or another. And I think that's going to definitely be the case in this space going forward. So I think it's just an important reminder that when you have a situation like this, it's best to be skeptical and maybe not assume too much.
Interesting. I think you're hinting at some things here that I, for one, would certainly be thinking about, maybe even cheating and just asking you about right afterwards.
Well,
very interesting.
Very interesting. I think true crime is a genre that elicits strong emotions, but it's those kinds of situations that can easily be manipulated.
I agree 100%, and it's important to be skeptical.
Yes. Anyways, thank you all so much for listening to this episode of The Cheat Sheet. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you have a good and safe day.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.